The Gate and the Guardian, by Stephen Lake. The Guardian Series Part 2. A sonic boom filled the air as Paul raced to his latest call. From what dispatch had told him, this was an emergency, so he came as fast as he could. Arriving over the location that he had been sent to, he was appalled to see a damaged, smoldering building below him that showed obvious signs of struggle, carnage, and death. Landing in front of the building, he quickly took in his surroundings before realizing that, despite how quickly they'd dispatched him, it was already too late for the people inside. The only thing he felt in the now destroyed building was Rexes, and several of them. Any human life that had once been there had been extinguished. This made him mad. Just then a Rex briefly poked its head through one of the holes in the outer wall of the building and, upon spotting him, quickly withdrew hoping that he wouldn't see it. However, Paul already not only knew it was there, but also where it, and all of its buddies were. This made him narrow his eyes, smack his fist into his hand, and glare in their direction. "Alright, you little freaks, you want to kill humans, and be a general menace, then allow me to return the favor," he said quietly to himself. He built up a large amount of energy within his body and, with a quick, explosive shot, leapt through a hole in the wall, threw out his arms, and fired an energy blast in both directions, hitting 2 of the 4 Rexes as he did, and detonating them like a meat grenade, sending body parts and gore in every direction. He then flipped over mid-flight, and placed his feet against a wall on the far side, intending to push off it to send himself back the other direction. But instead he crashed through the wall and out the other side as it gave way under him. Not wishing to be deterred, he landed on the side of a nearby oak tree and pushed off it, sending himself flying back the other way, while at the same time shattering the tree into 1,000 pieces. Sailing back through the hole he'd just come through, he aimed at the 2 remaining Rexes, and fired at them as he passed. They too were completely obliterated as Paul sailed through a hole on the other side, and out of the building again. Stopping there quickly, he turned back to the still smoldering building and studied it. He then reached out with his mind and could tell that his attacks had been highly effective, leaving only 1 mortally wounded, and rapidly fading Rex behind. Its life force soon flickered, and then winked out. Not bad for a rapid strike, he thought to himself. He then floated over to the hole in the wall he'd come through, and studied the room inside. However, the incredible stench of burning wood, paper, plastic, flesh and other unsavory things assaulted his nose as their gut-wrenching odors drenched the room around him. To filter this out, he immediately raised a personal shield that created only clean-smelling, filtered air for him. He then moved through the hole into the building, and began to study the room around him. What he saw appalled and disgusted him beyond human measure. How many Rexes were they fighting, he thought. Clearly the 4 that he'd taken out couldn't have been the only ones that had been there. That meant that some others had also come through, and then escaped out into the wider area. Realizing this, he pulled his communicator out of his pocket and activated it. "Command, this is DB-05631. I've got eyes on 4 Rexes at the target location. All 4 are currently status deceased. However, from what I'm reading in the room, they likely aren't the only ones who came through, so be advised that we might have some more in the area, over," he said. "Roger, DB-05631. Acknowledging possibility of wild Rexes in the area. We'll be dispatching more units shortly to help you hunt them down," came the reply. "Thanks, I'll be looking for them." "Roger. Also, be advised, DB-05631, Command is wondering if there's an open portal present in the area, or has it been closed?" Paul furrowed a brow at this. He hadn't thought to check for that. He'd only initially been worried about the 4 Rexes he'd found in the building upon arrival, but not the potential for reinforcements via an active portal. Reaching out with his senses, he probed the entire building, and soon detected something on the 2nd floor. Floating out of the hole on the 1st floor, and up to the 2nd, he was surprised to see a large shimmering square on one of the walls as though it were made of water. Paul floated over and touched it. Upon doing so, he immediately withdrew his hand and floated back a short ways. "Yep, that's a portal all right," he thought. "Command, be advised, there is indeed an active portal on premises. I will be investigating and trying to close it down momentarily, he replied. Roger, we'll wait for further updates from you on the portal. Dispatch out. Paul then put his communicator away and studied the wall in front of him. It was unusual for the enemy to leave a portal open like this given the amount of energy that was required to run it. They only left them open if they planned to bring more reinforcements through. However, to his complete and total surprise, that was exactly what happened next as two powerful Rexes came charging through the portal and slammed headlong into him, sending him flying out of the second floor and into the air beyond. Quickly catching himself, he turned and looked back at the two Rexes and noticed that they were already leaping through the air at him. "Oh no you don't," he protested. He then zeroed in on the first one, grabbed it by the throat as it passed over him and, with a powerful heave, slammed it into the ground with such force that it buried the Rex so deep into the ground that only its tail was visible. He then turned and quickly searched for the second, discovering it soon after on a dead run towards a line of trees. "Not so fast, Ugly," he said. He then flew after the second Rex, grabbed it by its massive head, and drove it into the ground, burying it up to its waist, killing it instantly. Satisfied with his work, he again scanned the area. Other than the still fading life force of the first Rex, the area was clear. He wasn't worried about the one Rex that still remained alive, because he could clearly tell that it wasn't long for this world. And, sure enough, less than a minute later its life force winked out. "Well, this has been a fun assignment so far," he muttered sarcastically to himself. He then flew up to the hole in the second floor wall, into the building, and over to where the portal was. This time, however, he kept his distance as he wasn't about to get caught off guard twice in one day. Just then he noticed the wall shimmering like gently disturbed water. Something else was coming through. Immediately he built up energy in his body like a swelling wave as he prepared for yet another attack. A moment later a bulbous snout, with flaring nostrils, and sharp teeth, pressed through the portal, followed closely by two brilliant yellow eyes that were attached to a body that could easily rip a cow apart in moments. Upon seeing this, the energy in Paul's body ignited like a firestorm, causing the ground beneath him to shake and vibrate with its intensity. He then thrust his hands forward and fired two energy blasts at the Rex that ripped through it like it was made of tissue paper. The resulting explosion sent gore, blood and body parts splattering all over the room, some of which bounced off Paul's shields. It also sent the mortally wounded Rex flying across the room and into a vertical support beam. Seeing his clear and obvious overreaction, Paul quickly collected his wits as he tried to calm himself. "Rein it in, Paul, rein it in. We're not trying to level the place," he muttered to himself. He then turned and looked at the mortally wounded Rex as it lay on the ground nearby. The Rex soon turned its head painfully, and glared back at him. Paul was surprised that it was still alive given how hard he'd hit it just moments earlier. "Tough little snots, aren't they?" he thought to himself. Deciding to be merciful to the creature, he reached out with his hand and, with a gentle wave, caused the Rex to vaporize into a silvery blue ball of flame, energy and gore. Several pieces of the disintegrating Rex flew across the room and bounced harmlessly off his shields. It was at moments like this that he appreciated having them. It meant that he wouldn't be covered in blood and gore every time he killed one of them, or be forced to breathe in the stench that their deaths created. He then returned his attention to the wall, and saw that it no longer shimmered. He sighed in relief. For the moment, the gate was closed. So he relaxed his powers as he studied the room. The sheer number of dead bodies horrified Paul. "Looks like most of them died before they knew what hit them," he said quietly. He then summoned a stiff wind that blew through the building, and extinguished all of the fires that still burned around him, while also cleaning up and freshening the air. As the breeze eventually died down, he soon noticed a body laying on the ground not far away. Gesturing lightly to it, it rolled over to reveal a faceless head. Paul grimaced in disgust at this, and immediately rolled it face down again. He then continued through the rest of the building in search of other survivors, but found such widespread gore and mutilation that it made his stomach turn. When the Rexes had attacked, they'd been quick, deadly, and brutal. His body then glowed briefly with energy as the floor liquefied beneath him. This allowed him to sink through the carpet and into the room below. He stopped there briefly, just above the floor, before drifting sideways to avoid a pile of gore that lay below him. He grimaced at this as he forced his mind to shut out all of the gut-wrenching imagery he was seeing. It made him wonder just how high the casualty rates of this war had become, because this was not the first such incident he'd seen lately. There had, unfortunately, been many more. In fact, too many. As he was contemplating this, he sensed the approach of several men who were heading in his direction. Even more interesting was that all of them were armed. Curious about this, he turned and floated out of the building. As he alighted just beyond the front steps, a group of 9 men in combat fatigues, armed to the teeth, aimed their weapons at him, and then relaxed as soon as they recognized him. Paul furrowed his brow at this. "Why are you here?" he asked. "Command reported that there was a portal in this area, so we came to check it out." "Looks like they were right," said one of the men, who was a sergeant. Paul nodded. "It should be closed by now. But if you want to have a look, it was up on the 2nd floor. However, I can't guarantee that it won't reopen again soon," he replied. "Did you see any Rexes while you were in there?" asked the sergeant. Paul nodded again. "Yeah, quite a few. But they've already been dealt with." The sergeant briefly turned his attention to the building and its sorry, sordid condition, and frowned in disappointment. "It doesn't look like you did that great of a job." "The building is a mess," he muttered. Paul frowned. "It was already that way when I got here," he said flatly. The sergeant nodded. "Understandable given how many intrusions there's been lately. So, tell me where the gate is. We've got a mission to do." "Like I said, it's on the 2nd floor, but may not be open anymore." "That's fine. We'll go check it out anyways," said the sergeant. He and his men then started to advance towards the building, but immediately stopped when Paul stepped in front of them. The sergeant glared angrily at him for this. "Get out of our way," he barked. Paul narrowed his eyes. "I wouldn't advise going in there. It's not your choice. Now step aside." "We've got work to do," said the sergeant. Paul stared in disappointment at the men for several moments, and then stepped aside. If they wanted to die from stupidity, then he wasn't going to stand in their way. The men soon hurried into the building, and up to the 2nd floor where they found the gateway had reopened. Wasting no time, they quickly stepped through. Down below, Paul felt this happen, and then shook his head in disgust. He knew the men's chances of survival on the other side were non-existent, and yet they had gone anyways. He then turned and prepared to go, given how much other work still remained for him to do, but paused a moment later. While what the sergeant, and his men, had done was indeed foolish and suicidal, Paul was a guardian, and thus leaving them to die was not something he could allow, as that's not how guardians behaved. They'd sworn themselves to save every life they could. Even idiots like them. On top of that, Paul couldn't just leave right now. There were far too many questions that still needed to be answered. Sighing deeply, he turned and, with a gentle leap, sailed up to a hole in the outer wall of the building on the 2nd floor, and floated inside. Once there, he found that the same small section of wall as before was once again shimmering. That meant that the gate had indeed opened again. This caused him to groan in frustration. He then drew a large amount of energy into his body as he prepared himself to step through. After a few moments, he strode purposely forward and glided through the portal with great ease. Reappearing on the other side, he found himself standing in an alleyway that rested between 2 large, fire-gutted brick buildings. He then took half a step forward, and immediately paused. Something wasn't right. It felt like the warmth of summer had been replaced by the empty coldness of winter. Curious, he tried to draw in more energy, but found that none existed anywhere around him. What he had brought with himself was all there was, or likely would be. This caused a slight tinge of fear to pick at the back of his mind. Without any additional energy to draw upon, he would be limited in how long, or how hard he could fight. He briefly took a deep breath, and then walked down the alleyway until he reached a cratered and fire-charred street. He felt sick when he saw all of the carnage around him. Just then something caught his attention. He turned to his right just in time to see 5 of the men from earlier racing towards him with 2 Rexes close behind them in hot pursuit. Seeing this, he raised his right hand and, with 2 quick blasts, annihilated the Rexes. However, this powerful discharge made him flinch as he felt his power reserves drop off sharply, before rebounding slightly. Just as he'd expected, any fighting he could do here would be brief and limited. That didn't sit well with him in the slightest. Having an ample supply of additional energy to draw on would be critical to his survival. Unfortunately, that was not going to be possible. It was no wonder the Rexes, and all the other creatures, were so adamant in their efforts to conquer his dimension. Nearly all of the energy in theirs had already been depleted. So they needed to find a fresh source of it, and soon. Hence the invasion. He would have to relay this to Central as they would need to know this. In the meantime he needed to focus on surviving, and rescuing the men who'd foolishly entered before him. Be conservative, Paul. You've only got a limited amount of energy to work with, and we don't want to drain the tank if we can help it, he muttered to himself. He then motioned to the 5 men to come his way. But just as he did, a group of massive tentacles erupted out of a nearby building, engulfed the men, and drew them inside. This was followed by brief screams of terror, and then silence. Seconds later the building exploded as a hail of tentacles erupted out of it like a geyser. They soon lashed out at Paul, who quickly pushed off from the ground, and backflipped through the air to avoid them. Several more erupted out of the ground below him and tried to capture him, but were immediately blocked by a series of shields that appeared. Paul grimaced as he felt the incredible drain this made on his energy supply as his shields fought desperately to deflect and ward off the hostile tentacles. He then rolled to the side and landed on the ground in a 3-point stance before leaping to the side again as yet another bundle of tentacles lashed out at him. Looking for ways to keep fighting, while saving as much energy as he could, he reached under his cloak and drew out a long, double-bladed collapsible staff, and used it to slice through the tentacles as they struck out at him. After several moments of fruitless effort the tentacles withdrew, giving Paul a temporary reprieve. Even so they remained active as they continued to sway and writhe together as one, like the flame of a candle, periodically stretching towards him, and then retreating as though sizing him up. Ugh, that cost me a bit more energy than I planned on. I need to get back through that gate soon, before I run out of juice, and this thing has me for breakfast, he thought to himself. He then shifted his stance and launched himself at the tentacles as they withdrew in surprise. However, instead of attacking them, Paul had used this brief feint to buy himself the time he needed to retreat back to the portal he'd come through, and escape. But, as he did, more tentacles exploded out of other nearby buildings like a tidal wave, their green and silver snake-like forms charging at him with breathtaking speed. Paul sensed them coming, but continued to press on as he raced towards the alleyway. The tentacles continued their pursuit, quickly closing on him as they did. However, to their complete surprise, just as he reached the portal he'd come through, he spun around and fired 2 quick energy blasts at the closest group of tentacles, vaporizing them as he did. He then sailed backwards through the portal and reappeared inside the building on the other side, his full strength instantly returning to him as his body drew in substantial amounts of the energy around him like a hungry child nursing from a fresh bottle. He then continued to sail backwards through the room, and out through a hole on the other side as a morass of tentacles flooded through the portal in pursuit of him. He then fired a single, powerful energy blast that struck the tentacles squarely in the middle, detonating with such force that it vaporized them, and the entire building around them. Realizing how much he'd overdone it, he quickly enclosed his entire body in a fiery blue energy shield and rode out the explosion until it dissipated. Feeling that it was now safe, he unwrapped himself from the shield, and made a graceful landing in the soft earth below him. He then stared in the direction of the building, but found that only a smoldering pile of debris remained in the place where it had once stood. There wouldn't be any fixing or cleaning up his mess this time. Even so, he needed to be sure that the portal was closed, and the job complete. Reaching out with his senses, he found that the portal indeed no longer existed. Then again, neither did the building. so it was unlikely that the portal would have survived either. Breathing a sigh of relief, he turned and leapt into the air as he began to fly away. Welp, there won't be any more Rexes coming through that gateway anytime soon. But what was that thing that attacked me, he said to himself. He soon shook his head, and said, man, this war just gets weirder by the day. As he continued to fly away into the distance, on his way back to headquarters for his next assignment, a pair of Rexes appeared from within a nearby line of trees and watched him leave. Once he was out of sight, they turned, and faded through a nearby portal, and back to their home dimension.